Hi everyone, it's Henry here, and this week's video isn't exactly what I had planned in the first place. I was fortunate enough to have my first game of Titanicus in about a year and a half the other day against the lovely Matt Woodsmith from the Full Stride podcast. Well worth a listen if you like your Titanicus podcast. And it was a great game, it was great to relearn the rules and all the rest of it, but one thing that became abundantly clear as I was driving home, licking my wounds, plotting his downfall, was that I needed to add some knights into my list. And seeing as there was a really nice response to my army project Slave to Darkness video last week, I thought I'd do another one in that vein, looking at how I'm going to add some knights from House Caesarean into my Legio Krytos force. So much like the last video, this isn't our typical tutorial style video, but I will take you through most of the processes that I went through to paint these knights for me. So this is for my gaming army, which meant I was going to follow all the same rules I did when I painted the Titans themselves. This is how I went about getting this household scheme painted in a couple of hobby sessions. I've got some big projects coming up, so I doubt I'm going to get much personal hobby time. So I needed to get these painted up fast, looking good, and ready for me to have a few games with. I wanted the yellow for my take on House Caesarean to be fairly muted, so I used a couple of colours from Ammo by MiG from the Dunkelgelb range. It's a range of airbrushing paints. They are very, very thin. I hardly needed to thin them at all to use them, and I'm spraying at about 25 psi, 0.4 needle, using our Harder & Steenbeck Cotter Paint Infinity. Because they are so thin, just be mindful when you're spraying them on that you don't spray too much in one area and it moves around and you get it pooling. So a few coats of that just to give me this nice sort of brown base to work from. Then I took my Tamiya flat white. I use this for most projects, you'll notice when I'm using that, where I want to do a bit of pre-shading, where I want to provide some bright white underneath the next colour to give that colour a little bit more punch. Or in some cases, not necessarily punch, just a bit of a helping hand to show up. And yellow is a classic example of a colour that really needs that helping hand. So it's fairly simple zenithal highlighting. I go into a lot more detail on this on the Patreon article when I'm painting the Titans, but I don't want anything too extreme with pre-shades when I'm working on models at this scale. So just getting it nice and bright and ready for the next yellow. As I said, the yellow that I wanted to go for was a little bit more muted, a little bit more low key. So this is the Dunkelgelb base from the Dunkelgelb set. I only used the dark base and the base from it, didn't need the other colours, but I'm looking forward to trying them out on a sort of 28mm scale project. And if anything, this was even thinner than the dark base. I didn't need to thin it at all. First shot you've seen me there doing, I had thinned it. It was just way too thin. It was going to take me like a million coats to cover it. So tipped it out and just used it neat from the pot. No paints are ever guaranteed to be airbrush ready, even if they're airbrush paints. It's all about playing around with the consistencies, how you airbrush, what pressure you spray out, all that sort of thing. So just never take it on face value. Just get it working how you want it to work. And then once I had a few layers of that yellow on, I went back with the base. I did dilute it this time, and I just wanted to blend the shadows in a little bit more. Just make sure we're picking them out. See there on those almost vertical sides on the top hull was worth just darkening them ever so slightly. And that's the airbrush work done for the night. So nice and simple, just a couple of colours. Now, I really enjoy using oils to get different colour into my models. So I've used a colour called Dust here by Absalom 502. Used a colour called Yellow Ochre using Winsor Newton Artist Oil Colour. And then lastly, I'm using this really gross colour called Industrial Earth by Absalom 502 again. I just opened this bottle. You see all the oil had collected at the top, which is what all that stuff is there that's come out on the cardboard. Now this isn't your traditional sort of oil paint rendering where I'm using it to create really interesting streaks and all that sort of thing on the model. Really, this was just to not decolor's the wrong word. just to mix the colour up a little bit, to give it a little bit more interest. I felt it was a touch too dull for my liking. And by using these 3 paints here, I've taken a brush there and I've just dipped it in some mineral spirits. I use Winsor Newton Sansador, odourless mineral spirits. And then I'm just using a very damp brush, so I take most of the excess off and I just move that paint around the surface. And you can see it just gives us a few slightly different tones on there, so different hues on there. You don't need to be super accurate with this at all. And you may choose not to do it at all. As I said, this isn't so much a tutorial, this is just how I enjoy painting. And I often get questions, if you post a model up and someone says, oh, have you done it? It's a lot easier to just sort of demonstrate like this than just give people a list of colours. So you might be able to pick up on the video the difference we've got on the right leg there compared to his left leg. You may not. I suspect it will show up better in a photograph. So once I've been around the entire model, I let it dry. Just pop a hairdryer on it. Once it's touch dry, it's fine. And then I'm going to spray it with a few coats of Vallejo polyurethane gloss varnish. This is to give it a nice shiny surface with very little surface tension on, so I can go in and do a bunch of pin washing. For this I'm using an enamel wash, Standard Desert Camo. This is the type of painting that I enjoy. I enjoy using these different products, and you might notice certain crossovers with some of our tutorials that we do. But there's also probably things I'll do in this that I wouldn't necessarily do in a tutorial. So I had to get it done nice and quick. Now for the chipping, I tried the highlight colour from the Dunkelgelb set, but because it was so dilute, it really wasn't very good for this step. I wasn't able to get the paint thick enough really to stay where I wanted it. So what I did was mix in a little bit of Vallejo model colour Ice Yellow into the Dunkelgelb base. So this lightened the paint, but it also made it a bit thicker, so I was able to have a bit more control over it. And I just go around and add just a ton of chips with my brush like this. I don't use a sponge. I don't like the effect it gives at this scale. So it's just a case of settle in and put some good music on or whatever and just start working your way around the model. I choose to spend a bit of extra time on steps like this, and I save time on future stages, which means I can still get this sort of project done in a couple of hobby sessions. I'm just thinking about where would most of the damage occur. It's the shim plate's going to have plenty of damage on it. There'll probably be more slightly lower down than there would higher up. But just have a bit of fun with this stage. Don't worry if you make a big splodge, because you're just going to put this darker brown colour over most of it anyway. And this dark brown I'm using is Vallejo Panzer's Dark Rust. But it doesn't really matter. Any dark brown would be fine. It's one of those paints that I've had since pretty much since I got back in the hobby. It's just, I think everyone's got their little go-tos. I know how it behaves. This is a gaming project. We're not looking to try and be too clever with anything here. We just want to make a cool looking model that's going to look good, under the living room lights or down the club or whatever. And I'm just filling in the majority of the areas that I've done with the lighter yellow colour, leaving a few of them showing. It's worth saying as well, when I did the pin wash, I also applied my decals. Once they were all dry, I left them overnight and then gave the model a coat of Armour by MIG Lucky Varnish Ultra Matte. And that's the finish I wanted on my armour. And obviously I have blacked out all of the trim and all of the metal parts on the model, but I didn't think that was particularly interesting. Then for the skeleton, I absolutely love Vallejo Metal Colour Series Steel. You need to shake them a lot. If you're going to use them with a hairy brush like this, I would suggest you use them on a traditional sort of plastic palette or a tile or something. Don't use them on a wet palette. And don't put too much on there because they do split over time. I wanted to leave the trim black. There's nothing that really tells us Caesarean's black and yellow, that's it. It doesn't tell us what's what. So I thought black trim would be a bit more interesting and make it look less like Furians or something like that. And just like we did with that light yellow chipping, I'm just using a colour here, scale 75 Graphene Grey. I'm just tapping it along a lot of the edges to create little scratches and little bits of battle damage on the black. So nice and simple. So 2 colours for the black, 3 colours for the yellow. But just taking a little bit of time over it, considering what I'm doing and why I'm doing it. Hopefully, we get a cool effect. And importantly, it's fun, And speaking of fun, probably the most fun stage is adding a little oil wash to our metals. So I'm using a black and a brown oil here, about 50-50. I've used lamp black and burnt umber, I think, here. Doesn't matter, brown and black. Thin them down, some mineral spirits. Create a wash. So just like you'd use, your GW Nuln oil and Agrax and things like that, you're just using oils here instead. It gives you a slightly different effect. They're slightly different to use. If you fancy getting into oils or giving them a try, this is where I would start. Black and a brown, have a play around with some washes. You'll have a lot of fun with it. And then we just slop it all over. And this is going to be it for the metal. I may do a tiny bit of highlighting, perhaps around like really prominent areas with something like lead belcher or something when it's all dry, but generally I'm just going to leave it at this. It looks really, really good, I think anyway. It's not a lot of work. And for the pistons, there's not many of them on the model, but I like to do this on these minis. I've taken a very, very bright silver, so in this case steel, you could use chrome, something like that. And I'm just going to paint in the pistons. Just think it's a nice little bit of detailing to do. Now, unfortunately, I lost a bunch of footage. I don't know what happened, the card corrupted or something, but for the energy thing in the middle of his shield and for the end of his spear, I've just base coated it decayed metal, it's a sort of bronzy colour. And then I just followed the steps I did in the verdigris video a few weeks ago, so I'll link that up in the corner so you can see exactly what I've done for it. I'm not a really big fan of OSL on my models, so that's why I thought I needed a little bit of colour, a little bit of interest in there. So I've done similar to what I do on like plasma weapon, energy housings, things like that. Other than that, there's a little bit of fettling here and there. I tried to film doing the eye lens, but it was just too tiny to get it nicely in focus. But all I've done for the lens is done a layer of bright silver, and then I've painted on with my hairy brush a couple of coats of Tamiya clear red, just to give me a red lens. I think looks really nice, and it's very simple to do. I've done it on all the Titans. Speaking of which, if you are interested in sort of more of this kind of project, I've got a ton of things on our Patreon to do with this. Got recipes for 5 or 6 different Legios, and I've got a huge great PDF on how I did my Krytos project as well. So if you dig that kind of thing, it's well worth checking out. Other than that, as I said, I did a tiny little bit of highlighting with a mid-silver around the face area. Did a tiny little bit of chipping with that silver as well, just on bits that I thought would get damage real sort of repeatedly, so they wouldn't get time to corrode so much. The base, I've done exactly the same as I've done on my Titans. Just need to make sure I go to, Versatile Terrain, give Keith a bell, order some wicked looking nameplates. I'm also going to make a bunch of banners to hang between the knight's legs, pennants. I'm going to do those all together when I've got the rest of the knights painted up and help them match my Titan ones. So I might do a video on that if people fancy it. And then other than that, just a little bit of oil streaks, which again you see us do on most videos, and I'll link up in the top how I did it. Just teeny tiny oil streaks. Just be careful that you don't sort of paint massive ones on there like you might do on a 28mm model. Might look a little bit weird. But I hope you've enjoyed this take on House Caesarean, my take on House Caesarean, and how I've approached getting this project done super quick this week, ready for me to have a few games with. As I said at the start, we've got a few big projects coming up, so we'll be back to our normal style of tutorials very, very soon. If you've enjoyed the video, hit the like button. If you're not already, hit subscribe and hit that little bell. You'll get notifications of when our next videos are coming out. Thank you ever so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.